Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and I wanted to bring another Steel Division 2 deck overview to you guys. Today, we're taking a look at the Panzer Lehr division. Lehr is a very interesting division. It was changed in the last update that came with the new Italian DLC, to mainly replace all of its Panzer Grenadiers with a unique variant that can only arrive in half tracks, but they all carry Panzer Shreks. This has really changed up. This has definitely changed how you build Lehr, and as such, it is quite interesting now, or at least a little more interesting than it used to be. Without further ado, let's jump into it. So to start off, we start off with the SPW 234. This is a basic autocannon, very good at supporting infantry due to a good rate of fire and that large amount of HE rounds it can fire. And that's going to be an important purpose, is that we need a lot of vehicles that are able to support our infantry because of its lower numbers and kind of high cost. So the 234 does that quite well. On the other hand, we have the 234 Puma. This has a 50mm cannon on it, meaning that its penetration actually is enough to threaten even medium vehicles. Shermans and T-34s will actually be able to be penned, although at 1500 meters and with paper-thin armor, the Puma needs to be able to sneak up and usually perform a flank. However, having something that's 45 points potentially be able to help kill enemy medium armor is quite good. Also, it's just really good at sniping enemy transports and similar things, so it has benefits there. It has a small amount of HE rounds, and that is a little beneficial, but it's not as good as autocannons in terms of supporting infantry, but it's not awful. Then in Phase B, we get the SDKFZ 259, or 250-9, and that's essentially just another 12 autocannons that we're going to make use of. And that's the important thing, is that we're able to further support our infantry with a steady stream of autocannons to help compensate for them. The other recons aren't interesting. There is potentially an argument to run a second card of Pumas, but I prefer the autocannons because we need to support our infantry more than we need armor killing. But the Panzer IV-J and the Panther really aren't worth it, and I would say the recon squads are not really up to snuff either. There could be an argument for the Spa Trupp, but there is a bit of a problem in that it's just not big enough. I forget the exact name. I think it's like the Edekensgrupp, but that's a recon squad that was like 8-man, and it's got an MG and a ton of G43s, but it was an actual combat squad. If we had those, I would definitely put them in here because it would give us a strong or some extra infantry to work with, but because we don't have that, I really don't want to try to get used to the Spa Trupp and try to use those as actual infantry. They're just too small. I prefer leaning on autocannons here. Then we go on to the infantry. So something you'll notice is that pretty much all the infantry are going to be within half tracks, and that does cause some problems with the cost of these units. The Panzer Grenadiers are stuck in the half tracks, but we're going to end up also wanting to put our close range squads in half tracks to protect them and make sure they don't get sniped. So this is an expensive tab, and it's why the autocannons are going to be so important, because we need to support this efficiently. But regardless, this is a pretty basic infantry tab. In Phase A, we have a single squad, or we have a single card of Strum Pioneers. Their flamethrowers help to displace enemy infantry, and they have SMGs. Effective close-range squads, quite basic. Then we have 2 cards of Panzer Grenadiers. These obviously have to come in half tracks, and they have Panzer Shreks. The Panzer Shrek is really, really strong. And the fact that literally all of our Panzer Grenadiers have these is actually really powerful. Most notably, the Panzer Shreks are... It essentially means that wherever our infantry is, we're going to have a source of AT to use, and it's 250 meters, meaning that armor is going to have a very hard time in cities because they're just going to get sniped by any of our, 40, 50 Panzer Shreks. In Phase A, we make up these 2 A cards in order to have a decent amount of infantry. Otherwise, we'd be working with, say 14 infantry squads, and that's just not a whole lot. Then in Phase B, we get a card of Pioneers. This is to help give us more close-range squad due to the frag grenades. We have another card of the Panzer Grenadiers with Shreks. Then Phase C follows the exact same pattern. Card of Pioneers and a card of Panzer Shreks, or Panzer Grenadiers with their Shreks. No leaders included in this roster. I feel like it's difficult to really fit them in due to the fact that we just don't get a whole lot of them. There could be an argument maybe swapping one Panzer Grenadier for a Pioneer Führer, so you have some grenades to toss, but I feel like you have a very high risk of just not having enough infantry to make it through the phase. Another suggestion is also swapping the Strum Pioneers and the regular Pioneers to something like this. That has the effect of your Strum Pioneers are coming a bit later, and you do get more of them with veterancy, which is quite nice. And you do get the Pioneers early on to better fight in close range. They both have their upsides and downsides. But in general, this is how you want it, and at least in my opinion. There is also a reason you could also do something a little more crazy. Essentially, we take out one of the Panzer Shreks, and we put them, and we fill Phase C heavily with this Grenadier squads. And then, using one of the Pioneers, we put an extra Pioneer, and essentially we have 10 Pioneers and 8 Panzer Grenadiers in Phase A, and then Phase B, and then Phase C brings us a lot. This is probably a late game build of the infantry tab. This is like you're deciding that you're going to really want to drag this game out, and it does give you the most amount of infantry. 92, although not the largest contingent, is manageable and can work. But you do run the risk of potentially running out of infantry really quickly in Phase A. So it's a bit of a high risk, but that might be the best option if you're looking to take this long. But otherwise, I personally was taking Pioneers in Phase C to have a large amount of close-range brawlers in the late game. But I think there are a variety of options. Moving on to armor, this one is an interesting one. There's a lot of options here depending on how you want to take the game. We have the Panzer IIIs, which are light tanks. They have low penetration and limited armor, but they are very effective as infantry support. They have the HE shells, they have their machine guns, and they're notably extremely cheap, only 30 points. So the Panzer III serves as a very nice infantry support vehicle, and they're quite numerous in Phase A. You also have the Panzer III Führer. This is just the same Panzer III, but it has the leader alongside radio. So very useful to park something like right behind a massive infantry or near artillery, and just get that extra benefit. Definitely keep it out of combat though, because it will not survive if it gets stuck in a fight. Then we have 4 Vet 1 Panzer IVHs. The Panzer IV is your very standard medium tank. It's quite good, especially when vetted. So combining these Vet 1 Panzer IVs with a Panzer III Führer can give you those 2-star Panzer IVs, which are quite the threat to deal with. We have 4 of these in Phase A in order to have that. And then the final unit we have in Phase A are some Panther Ds. These should actually be vetted. The Panther Ds are a little bit cheaper than than other Panthers, and notably are more available. We take 2 of these Panther Ds in order to have a efficient response to heavier armor in the early game, namely obviously in Phase A. Without it, you can sometimes run into the problem of not having an answer to certain heavy armors. And granted, there are other ways to deal with this, but I always liked having a little bit of heavy armor to support the early game. You could actually, we should run the Panther D Führers, since we actually get the same amount of them vetted. But they have the leader and radio RS, so these are highly efficient. But that extra punch that they offer, and when backed up by additional Führers, could be quite powerful. With the Panther D Führer, in fact, now that I'm thinking about it, you could drop the Panzer III versions and instead load up with extra Panzer IVs, potentially late game, if you wanted to take the game long, which this doctrine can do. But we'll leave the Panzer III Führers in there for now. Phase B is pretty simple. We get another card of Panzer IVs and 4 Tigers. The Tigers have strong front and side armor, which is very, very nice. This makes them very good brawler tanks, and they have relatively good penetration, obviously. They're very good all-rounder tanks, and they're a bit cheaper than the Panthers, so it's a bit easier to get them out. And then Phase C is very simple. At least in this current iteration, we just take a bunch of Panthers. Could potentially run a lot of Panzer IVs, or if you wanted to take the Tigers, you could also take 8 of those in Phase C. That is a legitimate option, and you can swap these almost freely, and just it kind of depends on what you're looking for. I like the Panther because it has a slightly higher penetration and stronger frontal armor. Slightly stronger frontal armor, I should say. It's also a little bit faster. And I think it's just the Panther's a little more flexible overall compared to the Tiger, and hits a bit harder. Moving on to the support tab, it's a very straightforward one. We have our flamethrower group, we have our MG42s. Both of these are to support our infantry forces. We have a commander in the cheapest armored version. The Panzer IV and Panther commanders are just not really needed. They're just more expensive, and they shouldn't be seeing combat. Then we have a B phase card of Opel Blitz munitions to supply our units. If you want to, you could maybe find room for some grills. This gives more infantry support and could be quite the strong option, but it does get expensive to put it up. You could potentially consider cutting the commander, although not having a commander does sting. But the main thing is that the grill could be quite good at further supporting your infantry. Moving on to our anti-tank, one thing to note is that we don't need the Panzerschrecks or the Panzer Vernichtungen. I'm butchering that name again. But you don't really need these because all your infantry have Shreks. You don't need those. So we can just focus on long-range vehicle or towed AT guns. And that's exactly what we've done. The Martyr 3 is a very efficient A-tab unit, 50 points. It's got the APCR for very high penetration. AP is also quite decent. You get 4 of them. They help to back up your Panzer IVs and Panthers into a decent configuration. Phase B brings about a series of Pak 40s alongside the Jagdpanzers. The Pak 40s are very standard. They're just really, really good overall. Meanwhile, the Jagdpanzers are well armored, having armor similar to that of something like the Tiger. In fact, they have a little more, the same as the Panther, actually. So they're very durable. And although they don't have the strongest penetration, they're also a lot cheaper. They're overall very effective units. And combined with the Tigers in Phase B, you got a lot of armor to work with along with what you have from A. There are a lot of cards of Jagdpanzers. If you wanted some, you could take some Jagdpanzers in Phase A, but I actually prefer the Martyrs. They're half the price, which makes it a lot easier to afford them in the early game compared to the Jagdpanzers. And they still do their job quite well. In fact, they have the APCR, which gives them that extra punch, meaning they can actually threaten some vehicles that the Jagdpanzer might struggle to deal with. Something that comes to mind is something like the Sherman Jumbo. This actually has the penetration to frontally pen it, which is quite useful. You could also take the Jagdpanzers in Phase C, and in this case I would probably replace the Panthers with something like Panzer IVs, and then you rely on your medium tanks alongside a large amount of Jagdpanzers to carry the late game. But that does offer more flexibility, but also might make it a bit more expensive because you're paying, you might have to buy more overall. The anti-air tab is quite simple. We have Gepards as our Phase A. They start out at Veteran C, they come with 4 cards. It's the same thing as if you were to bring a Flak 38, but this one is armored, so it's not going to die to small arms fire, and it's armored, so it's not going to die to indirect fire nearly as much. Phase B is made up of Flak 41s. They're very flexible. They have a long range, 3,000 meters at contesting armor, which for 1v1 is quite large. It can cover, usually 2 of these can cover almost the entire map, which makes them very efficient for anti-air duty, alongside providing emergency anti-air or even firing their HE shells to soften up enemy units. We have 4 of those, so they're quite flexible. You could bring them in a munition truck, but I feel like that's a bit overkill. It makes them quite expensive. And then in Phase C, we bring in 2 veteran Whirlwinds. These are very similar to the SD KFZ-71, which is quite a good late-game anti-air unit. The Flak Verlings are very powerful at shutting down enemy infantry, especially with veterancy, as they just lay down so much fire. But the Whirlwind has the benefit of, for only 5 more points, we can bring them in Phase C, compared to this, which we can only bring them in Phase B or A. The Whirlwind has to come in a little later, but we get 2 Veterancy 1 with them, making them quite powerful. And they are also armored and they are armored, meaning that they won't die to small arms fire. In fact, they even have 50 millimeters of frontal armor, meaning that some lighter AT, like a PTRS, would not be able to really do anything to them. That's quite a useful effect, and it makes the Whirlwind a very strong anti-air unit. Artillery is decently varied, but we stuck with a relatively basic loadout. We have the 81mm mortar, the one that, although costing a little bit more, has significantly more shells in it. You could take the basic one, but it doesn't have nearly the capacity for shells, which is, I think, a big problem, especially because we don't have supply trucks until Phase B. Phase B also brings about our battery Führers. These are essentially 4 leaders to make use of. They also have the radio trait, so that's quite useful, but they're mainly here for their leadership. And then Phase C, we get 2 Nebelwerfer 300mm. And these also come with a munition truck, so we can get an additional 2 munition trucks to keep these guys fed while using the other Opel Blitz supply trucks elsewhere. The big benefit of the Nebelwerfer is that it is a very powerful rocket artillery. It will absolutely rain destruction upon the enemy and does a lot of damage to anything that it gets caught in its blast radius. It coming in Phase C is a bit slow, and that's probably the biggest thing, is that it can leave you kind of lacking in artillery. But if you only take it in Phase B, you only get a single copy of it, and that may be fine. If you play it smart, using the munition truck, you're able to pick up the Nebelwerfer and probably wheel it around the battlefield, which could be quite good. And maybe that is the correct way to play it. In fact, we'll just do that right now. We'll take it in Phase B. It does leave us a little light on artillery. That's only 3 artillery pieces, so this might need further tweaks. For example, you could take the 152 millimeters or the Hummels. Both of those are heavy artillery pieces. You could also take the LEFH 105 millimeter as a cheap form of AT, or a cheap form of indirect artillery fire. I generally tend to, if you had to take one, I'd say something like the 152 or the Hummel are better. They're modestly costed, but you do get more of them, so you could make it work. This is the weak part of Lehr, is this artillery tab is expensive, and the air tab is even worse. Very basic air tab. We have some Focke-Wulf fighters. Focke-Wulfs are great. They got 4 20mm autocannons. That's very strong. They have medium resilience. Focke-Wulfs are just great units. We got 3 of them in Phase A. Phase B, we get some Focke-Wulf bombers. A 250 kilogram and a 450 kilogram bombs. Makes this a medium bomber. We really don't have any other options. The only other ones are the rockets, which could work. You do get a lot of them. If that's what you were looking for, you could make use of that. They're only slowed down a little bit, so you could potentially make this work as some of your fighters, because they're barely slowed down, only 60 kilometers per hour, which is notable, and they do have worse agility. But if you're faking them in Phase B, you could get 4 of them with, for example, that, and it's relatively the same as the Focke-Wulf. So maybe there's something there, but otherwise, you have like a basic defense, but that doesn't really matter. But that is the deck. The big benefit of Lehr now is the fact that you have such a dominating presence in close range against enemy armor. Armor is practically not allowed to exist in forests or in towns in any manner, because you just have so many Panzerschrecks running around. But the biggest problem with this division overall, its stuff is expensive. Most notably the infantry. It is just paying 40 points per squad and being forced to is backbreaking. And honestly, it might be a good idea to literally put all of your infantry in Opel Blitz or other trucks, and not have any of them in half trucks, which is normally not what you want to do, but with how expensive your Panzer Grenadiers are, it might be the right option. And as I talked about, there's potentially a lot of consideration for the tank tab. You could swap Tigers and Panthers. You could run more Panzer IVs and potentially try to squeeze in some extra Jagdpanzers. There is, I think, a fair amount of room to explore with Lehr. It's an interesting division, and I do like that it was changed to this more interesting one with these unique Panzer Grenadiers. But otherwise, that is going to be it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. Comment down below. Have you tried out Panzer Lehr at all? Or if you've tried it at all, also let me know if you've had your own decks. I love to see deck codes and people build their own, so post your deck code down below for Panzer Lehr. But otherwise, that is going to be it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and have a good day.